hey, it's Wes. Get off my chair. And it's time for a big review, the new Sony a7 IV. Just a little bit of background here, the Sony a7 III was an enormous hit for Sony. It was the camera that really proved that Sony, or mirrorless in general, could create a good camera with solid autofocus without really breaking the bank either. Something compact and efficient and attainable for most photographers, at least most working photographers. The Sony a7 IV is an enormously anticipated camera. It has been a very long time in the making, and people have been waiting for this for so long. So anticipation and expectation was so high. And now we finally have the production models shipping, and how does it stack up, and is it what we were waiting for? Let's dive right in, and as always, we're going to start with the categories, starting with the build quality. Something that surprised me here with the a7 IV is that it's not actually the same body as the a7S III. This is something that we've seen from Sony in the past, in that they upgrade their bodies. The high-end ones get the new body first, like the A9 Mark II, and then the a7S III. They get this new, thicker, more evolved form factor, and then they all just get pretty much the same thing. But this is actually subtly different in size. It's a little bit bigger. The grip is bigger on this than on the a7S III. The screen format is a little bit different as well, just the shape and size. We'll get a little closer in on that. But overall, it's a bigger, chunkier body than the a7 III right here. The grip is obviously larger, and the controls and dials have changed things up just a little bit. So let's dive in on that and go real deep. I have been shooting this camera in corporate, commercial photography, real estate, portraiture, family, outdoor, landscape, video, ballet. I've tried to cover all my bases here to really get a handle on everything this does. That's why these reviews take a long time. I'm not just going to pull it out of the box, look at the back screen, and see how it works. I really went in deep, and here we go. These are my thoughts and what I found. There's a big similarity here between the two cameras in how they cut costs, because similar to the a7 III, the a7 IV has a magnesium front, but then a plastic back. If you get the a7S III or the A9 II or A9 or A1, it's all magnesium housing, but they cut some costs here. And you can see some improvement on the dials here, a more accessible back dial. And then we have our locking EV dial. People had a lot of issue with the EV dial on the a7 III slipping around. This one you can unlock and then remap to whatever you want. And it's a nice chunky metallic dial. Similarly, the buttons and the dials on the back have a much more tactile feel to them. Focus zone nubbin moves more and is easier to relocate. We're going to see a big difference on the back here, and that's that our screens are totally different. Well, not totally. Obviously, the a7 IV has a flip screen, and I actually really like the implementation of this just compared to the a7S III. The a7S III had a little cutout in the top, and if you were using gloves or just grabbing at it quickly, it was really hard to access that cutout. This cutout in the bottom of the a7 IV is way more convenient, and if you're using gloves, you can get at that much more easily. I really like that. What I don't like all that much is just the general design of the flip-out screen. I know people have been asking for this, and it's a big deal that we finally have it, but it just feels so cheaply implemented. And I hate to complain too much about this, because yes, we are getting more stuff here, but there is nothing new here. We've seen these flip-out screens forever. If you want to see an interesting flip-out screen, look at the one on the Nikon Z9. That thing folds and rotates. It looks like you could hang an elephant off of it. Whereas this, it feels very plasticky, not fantastically confident. And all it does is flip out and turn around. This is a plus and a minus depending on whether you're a photographer or a videographer primarily. If you're a photographer primarily, a lot of the time it's easier if you're shooting from above or below. You just flip the screen up or flip the screen down, easy peasy. Whereas this one, you can't just do that. You've got to pull it out all the way and then rotate it around and then flip it up or down. So it has its ups and downs doing that. When we look a little closer, we see a lot more differences as well. Even just something as much as the eye sensor. So the eye sensor on the a7 III is up top, and on the a7 IV it's down bottom. So down bottom, it's easier to clean it out and keep it from gunking up. It gunks up pretty easily on the a7 III, but when you're in inclement weather like snow or rain, as soon as you take this off your eye, if the teeny tiniest little snowflake lands on that eye sensor, all of a sudden your camera's stuck in EVF mode until you wipe it down again. Whereas on the a7 III is in a much more protected position. Let's rotate things over to the side here, and we'll see one huge upgrade is not only just our connectivity, but the doors they're hidden behind. So the doors and flaps on the a7 III are really, they're kind of junky. Not super weather sealed, and they kind of feel a bit like a toy. The doors and flaps on the a7 IV feel fantastic. They dig right in. You can see how they work all their way around the ports to lock in place, lock out water. Now, they're not super rubbery like a R3 or a Z9 where you can really feel it sealing out, like you feel like you could take this underwater without water getting in with one of those cameras. This one, not as much. It's still a very plasticky door. You're not feeling a lot of sealing going on. But what you find under the doors is fantastic. We have a full-size HDMI port, phenomenal. We have this very thoughtfully designed microphone jack, which allows you to plug something into it without obstructing the flippy screen. That's phenomenal. We have a headphone jack, again, as we did before. But now we have something that looks the same on the face of it, but is actually entirely different. A new USB port. This is a USB-C port. It is no longer the previous old 5 gigabits per second and standard powered system. This is now a 10 gigabit per second super high-speed port that also does USB power delivery. And if you're tethering, you can send data much, much faster. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Much more confident flaps and ports and things. Now, this doesn't necessarily give it a higher score right from the get-go because the entire market has moved since the a7 III came out. Pretty much all of our mirrorless cameras now of this class, the R6 and the Z6 II, they are all very well weather sealed. They're very rugged, nice, confident bodies. So what's going on here isn't actually all that unusual. Let's rotate it around here. We've got the memory card door on the 3, and we've got the memory card door on the 4. And once again, we are more weather sealed. The flaps dig in further to keep water out, and it's a more confident design. Now, speaking of that though, it's still very plasticky feeling. Overall, there are some minor compromises, but this is a great feeling body. It's not 100% tough as nails. I'm going to give that an 8.5 out of 10 for build quality. Features. We've already talked a lot about the other features because that is a part of build quality, what is built into this camera. One of the biggest changes here is that we finally have dual UHS 2 card slots. So this one had one UHS 2, one UHS 1 with memory stick, which is ridiculous. And so if you're doing redundant shooting, which a lot of professionals do, you end up with really slow writing because you're going to be writing at the speed of the slowest card. Whereas in this one, they're both UHS 2 to begin with, and one of them is also a CFA port, Compact Flash Express Type A. Now, what do you want that for? If you're going to be shooting in the all-eye compression modes, if you switch over to S&Q, slow and quick modes, you need to be using a Compact Flash Type A card. Otherwise, you just can't get that data rate onto an SD UHS 2 V90 card. So many abbreviations and words and symbols. Additionally, the sensors. Our a7 III, it had a 24 megapixel sensor. We are upgraded to 33 megapixel sensor. It is generally speaking of the same variety as the one on the a7 III. We're looking at very similar dynamic range and ISO performance. Although, as we know, when you take a higher megapixel camera and scale it down to the same number of megapixels, ISO performance can appear to be higher because you have used that scaling to reduce noise. So that is fantastic. I mean, the image quality in the a7 III was already phenomenal. It's just that some people thought that 24 wasn't quite enough megapixels, so Sony bumped it up a nice, comfortable amount. Not too much, not too little. On the back here with features, the EVF has about a 50% improvement in dots, but the one on the a7 III was very low resolution to begin with. But the displays, the screens, the a7 III just had a VGA screen. This one, just a few more pixels than VGA. Very tiny upgrade. It's not a bright screen. It is not high resolution. This has been something that I have always griped about, so I'm not going to go too far griping about this. If you've seen my best versus worst video, I griped about that more. So yeah, not a huge screen upgrade. This screen probably cost Sony about 10 bucks at most, probably less. A really high quality screen like that you would see in a smartphone would cost maybe 40 to 50 bucks. It's kind of frustrating that we're paying more for this camera, spoiler alert, but that one thing hasn't been touched. On the inside, we have an updated, upgraded processor that allows us to shoot not only in lossless compressed RAW, honestly, my favorite feature of this entire shebang. I love shooting uncompressed if possible, but I hate the file sizes. All of a sudden, we've got lossless compressed, fantastic. And this also allows us to shoot in the a7iv HS formats, which is just means to say MP5 or HEVC, high efficiency video codecs. So you can create higher quality videos with a lower bit rate. So that's fantastic as well. Speaking of which, we can now shoot 4K 60p and we can use 10-bit 422. But that has some drawbacks, which we will speak about a little bit more later. One of the other biggest advantages of the a7 IV is you can switch your focus box color to red, which for some reason you couldn't do with the a7 III. That gray focus box, lose it all the time. One thing I want to talk to you about is one of my favorite features of this camera, which is the advance of the creative looks. On the face of it, doesn't seem like a big deal, but to me, it's fantastic. In a normal Sony camera, we have contrast and saturation and sharpness. And this affects our JPEGs as well as our preview in camera. And so what this does for us as a RAW shooter, you can really take control of what your preview is going to look like. Which means if you're going to be showing an image to your client after it has been taken, even as a RAW file, you're going to be able to show them something much closer to what your actual finished product is likely to be. So you can adjust these sliders until the point that we are somewhere closer to what your end result will be, which makes the image preview much more useful to you. Now, generally speaking, I actually like to crank up the sharpness a little bit on this because that increases the perceptual sharpness of your preview images, which can be important, especially when you're using a viewfinder or a screen that has somewhat subpar sharpness. Additionally, we have 5 GHz Wi-Fi, which allows much faster tethering and transfer. Honestly, I don't rely on that myself. I love that super high speed USB-C port. Another upgrade, depending on who you ask, is the color science. The a7 IV has greatly changed color science. We have much more flattering skin tones in here. I can't speak to whether or not that's more accurate, but it is more flattering. It reminds me much more of a Nikon profile. We also get some upgrades that we only saw in the a7S III. We have active image stabilization, as well as being able to stabilize in post using Catalyst Browse and Catalyst Prepare from Sony. This lets you not use stabilization in your camera, which you have to remember to not do in advance, and then stabilize in post, and it's actually phenomenal quality stabilization. But you have to choose in advance which one you want to use. Unfortunately, both of these result in significant cropping. Speaking of which, let's talk about what's missing in features here. We don't have 8K video, obviously, not like the A1. We don't really expect that, but that's something some cameras have. We don't have 4K 120 like the a7S III has. And we don't have 1080 240 like the a7S III has. And for some reason, when you're shooting in a7iv HS in 4K, you can't do 30p, which is weird. A lot of people like to shoot in 30p. I'm shooting in 30p right now, just so that I can shoot in 4K on my A9 and still have both of these cameras in front of me. I'm using less cameras than usual because I have to have 2 in front of me right now. Another thing that's not upgraded that we're missing is the silent shutter. This sensor actually has a worse silent shutter than the a7 III. That's a bit of a kick in the pants for me because I love the silent shutter and I've considered selling my a7 III to buy another used A9 because I love using silent shutter so much. The one in the a7 III can't be trusted all the time and under artificial lighting, and the one in the a7 IV is even worse for this. It seems like they're scanning each pixel at the same rate that they used to, but because we have more pixels, it's even just that little bit more slow. Speaking of slow, when you switch to lossless compression or uncompressed, you're down to 6 frames per second on this camera. For a lot of people, isn't that bad, but when it comes to just the cameras this is being compared to, like the R6, that camera can shoot up to 20 frames per second. And so in a lot of modes, this one only shooting at 6 frames per second, that's a big hit for some people. We've got to talk about that crop. A lot of the video modes on this give you crop. And unfortunately, those crops compound on top of each other. And this really confuses me. Because if I'm already in a crop, because I'm shooting in 4K 60, we're in APS-C mode right from the get-go there, it still crops in further when you turn on active stabilization, and still crops in further when you turn on one of the best features of this camera, focus breathing compensation. I love that because one of my favorite lenses is this lens we're recording on right now, the 35G Master, which has kind of bad focus breathing. This can compensate for that. So you're already in a crop mode, then it crops further and crops even further. If you're using all these features, you're basically just using a micro four thirds sensor by the time you're done. I don't really understand why active stabilization has to crop in further when you're already in a crop mode, but that's just the way it is. So sometimes you have to kind of balance what you're going to crop and how much, because you might get yourself stuck in a position where your lens just isn't wide enough to get the shot that you want to get. Now, yes, I've thrown a lot of shade at this camera already, but I am measuring it to a high bar. Not only am I comparing it to its brethren, the R6 and the Z6 II, I am comparing it to other Sony cameras as well. So there is a field of features that this could have, but overall, when compared directly to its direct competitors, it has pretty much everything that they have. Just a few little things here and there that it might not. Gotta give that a 9 out of 10 for feature set. It is very well featured camera. Hey, it's Editing Wes, and before we finish this video, I want to jump in here and tell you about my new exciting preset pack. It's called Editing Your Own Photos. Let me show you. Alright, so we'll bring up a picture here that we really like, that we really want to just get just right. And so what do? Well, there are a few ways that we can go about this. Number one, if you're really getting started, you could find a picture that you really like, that you want to bring it closer to. So let's find one. This one right here. Really like the colors and the composition in this picture right here. So let's see what we can do. Now, if you don't know what all the sliders and things in your editing program do, feel free to just move them around one at a time and see what they do. Honestly, you don't even need to watch a YouTube video about this to get started. Just take the sliders, slide them up and down, and just to see what happens. And then, eventually, you will learn what every single one of those sliders does. We're looking much more wiggly now. So that's fantastic. So these things might take a while, but believe me, it'll be worth it in the long run. Go through every single setting that you have in your editor, whether it be Lightroom or Lumina or Capture One, and figure out what they all do. If there's a bar or a button that you don't know about, play with it. Up and down, all over the place until you know what it does and how it interacts with everything else. And also, if you want to see more image samples, check down below. Back to you, Wes. Handling and usability. As we discussed in the body section, there are some significant ergonomic upgrades to this. One of the most interesting ones is just this switch on the front here that quickly allows you to switch between photo, video, and S&Q modes. Again, the back screen has its ups and downs, got a better, deeper grip here, which is fantastic. We have a touch screen that really works. It's not just some random touch to focus stuff. You can go into the menu and you can touch things in the menu. That's great. And when you're using the camera itself, you can touch to track. You can choose whether it's just touch to focus or touch to track. That's fantastic as well. And speaking of image quality, these S-Log3 10-bit files are phenomenal to work with. This is something that brings us back to when the a7S III came out and you got that upgrade It is so easy to edit and grade these files. They look amazing, and they're even sharper than the ones in the a7S III because they are downscaled from a much higher resolution because the sensor is such a high resolution. Additional usability bonuses is, well, you've got that full-size HDMI jack. No more breaking cables all the time. Now, although this improved menu and touchscreen, yeah, that is great, but it is still so antiquated compared to what we're used to now with smartphones, Android, iOS, with zippy, responsive menus and scrolling and such. This is none of those things. It is so old-fashioned. So yeah, it's great to see them move forward a little, but they move forward so slowly in the camera industry. Another fantastic usability win is this remappable dial here. I have it remapped to white balance, so when I'm in video mode, I can roll around that white balance super easily, because I generally shoot in manual, so I don't need exposure comp. That's a fantastic thing. So now we have 4 independent dials on this. None of its competition even comes close. So I've got shutter speed on the front, aperture on the back, white balance on this wheel, and this an ISO wheel. 4 wheels all the time. Fantastic usability. You can really grab onto manual mode and take control. Speaking of taking control though, on its Canon counterparts on this back screen, you can touch on the exposure settings and then change them easily. This one, you can't do that. So it's a touchscreen, but not the most useful touchscreen. All right, but what are our hits against usability? Number 1, we have a laterally polarized touchscreen. What does that mean? Well, if you're wearing polarized glasses, you can't see the screen in some orientations. The A9 and higher end cameras have a circular polarized screen, so you can see it no matter what. You can solve this, however, because this was also an issue with the a7 III, just by putting a glass screen protector on it. As you can see here, it continues to work no matter what. But it does dim the screen. The glass screen protector scatters the polarization of the light and allows you to keep working. But you are still losing some light, whereas if you just have a higher quality screen, like on most smartphones these days, and on the higher end cameras, you don't need to go through that extra step. The battery. We have the same battery here, but we have less battery life this time. It's about 20 to 25% less battery life. Now, can you notice? Yeah, I did notice. But what I did really notice is that this camera gets hot. It's doing more and it's working harder, and I was really surprised at how much it heats up. If you have this camera, make sure you switch it to the high temperature shutoff mode. I go through all the modes in my menu system explainer, but you've got to do that, otherwise this camera can overheat quite easily. Once you're in high temperature mode, it generally won't overheat, but this body's going to get hot and it might shake your confidence in it a bit. And another hit against usability, obviously, is all that cropping that goes on. It can make it difficult to pre-visualize and be prepared for shots if you're shooting on prime lenses. Even if you're shooting on zoom lenses, sometimes you just don't know how wide you have to prepare for because it's going to be cropping in, depending on the modes that you use in video. And for me personally, the biggest hit in usability is that slightly worse electronic shutter. So here we are in the bathroom, the room with the worst LED light, and I actually unscrewed the LED lights that aren't the worst in this room to test out the rolling shutter effect, or rather how that affects our artificial light banding in video. So we're shooting 4K 30p right now. All of our cameras are at 1/60. So let's see what happens when we change. So here we have the A9, we have the a7 IV, and we have the a7 III. So as we can see, even on the A9, we have a band moving through the frame here. It's a little more apparent on the a7 IV, a little less apparent on the a7 III. So we'll move up 1/80th of a second. So the a7 IV is looking terrible right now. None of them are particularly usable though. Then we'll move up to 1/100th of a second. Move up to 1/125th of a second. Still not great. 1/160th of a second. Looking real bad now. And even the better scan speed in our A9 is not saving us right now. But as we can see, the scan on the A9 is looking much better than the scan on the a7 IV, but it's looking almost the same as the one on the a7 III. 1/200th of a second. Again, the A9 and the a7 III are looking very similar. And 1/250th of a second. Lots of bars there. Let's see if we go down below our 180-degree shutter speed here. What happens? All right, now we're all at 1/50th. Looking a little better. We go to 1/40th. Looking pretty clear, but this is not an ideal shutter speed for 30p video. All the way down to 1/30. No, still not fantastic. Let's see if we can change this by getting out of 4K and going into 1080p. All right, here now we're shooting at 1080p. We're still at 1/30th, so 1/30th of a second shutter speed. So let's bring this up to 1/60th, as we should be for 30p video. Looking a little clearer now. I suspect that our scan speed must have increased on the sensor. 1/80th. This is a little bit worse. 1/100th. 1/125. Yeah, so obviously our scan speed, and we know that our rolling shutter is greatly improved when we go to 1080 over 4K. 1/160th. Looking pretty bad now. A9 pretty resistant at this point. 1/200th. Ooh, now we're really breaking. And then 1/250th. Not great at all. All right, now we're gonna try that variable shutter. We're at 4K 60p. Honestly, it doesn't look any worse than the regular 4K. I was expecting it to be worse, but obviously we have our scan speed really sped up by cropping in to get that 4K 60. So it looks like the 4K 30 with the full frame is definitely our worst for our rolling shutter artificial light performance. I was hoping in the Mark IV that we would get a better electronic shutter. So overall, this is, generally speaking, a very usable camera. It can get the job done quite easily. This is an 8 out of 10 for usability and handling. Image and video quality. I already spoke on this a little bit. The image quality is stellar. Unless you need a ton of pixels, this thing gets the job done. The images are lovely, the video is fantastic. Dynamic range is still class leading. The empirical measurements of the high ISO is no longer class leading, and so it just loses a tiny bit there. But overall, I've got to give this a 9.5 out of 10 for image quality and video quality, because it is just phenomenal. Now, if you want to pick up one of these cameras and support this channel, there are going to be links down in the description below to let you do that. I also have some accessories that I use with this camera linked down below as well. I have to mention this video is brought to you by Camera Canada. They have loaned me this camera free of charge, nothing in exchange. But if you could click on their links below if you need to buy one of these cameras in Canada, that would be fantastic to help support me and support the camera store that I work with and buy things from myself. Autofocus, another huge upgrade here. The a7 III was already great in its time, but the a7 IV brings it up a notch. We've got real-time tracking like we have in the A9, A9 II, and the A1. It is super easy to use. You've got touch to track on the back. We have animal, human, and bird eye autofocus, live eye autofocus in video. These are all phenomenal functions, but doesn't quite keep up with, obviously, the best and most expensive sports cameras from Sony, Canon, and Nikon. We wouldn't expect it to. Now, I have heard some people, and this is only after I had already taken thousands of pictures with this camera, complain about back focusing and poor eye AF. And honestly, I have not had any of those issues at all with this camera. And I have shot with the Viltrox 24, the Sony 35GM, the 55 Sony Zeiss, the Viltrox 50, the Sony 85G Master, the 70-200 f4. Oh, and I've also used the 85 Viltrox on this. So I've used a lot of lenses on this and have not experienced this issue. So I don't know if this is a firmware problem that can be resolved later, or if there's some sort of production issue, but I would suspect it has more to do with firmware than anything, and that we might see a fix for that pretty soon. Essentially, if you took someone from 5 years ago and put this camera in their hands, their minds would be blown by the autofocus. But we have moved the bar so far with intelligent tracking and algorithms and speed and so forth that I still can't give this a 10 out of 10 because the bar just keeps getting higher. So I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10 for autofocus. It in no way let me down, but I'm also aware that it's still not the fastest, most intelligent, and snappiest, because we live in a crazy world now where everything's so advanced. Value, this is where things start to get hard. The a7 III came in at $2,000 and blew everyone's minds because it was so effective and cheap. And Sony decided to not aggressively attack the market like they did last time. Could also be because of chip shortages that this is costing more, but this one lands at $2,500. Oof. So it's more. We were expecting Sony to undercut the market, they used to, but now we have the A1 that leads in price, and we have the a7 IV. Doesn't lead in price, but it's up there because, let's compare, the R6 is also $2,500. But the Z6 II is only $2,000. It competes directly with the a7 III, which the a7 III unfortunately gets beat out by it because it's older. But this has some features that it borrows from the a9 II and especially the a7S III, which are $4,500 and $3,500 respectively. So a lot of people can get the same job done that they were going to get done with the a7S III with this camera right here for $1,000 less. So that's fantastic. So yes, the price has gone up, but it does give you a lot of bang for your buck. But because some of its competition does cost less, I can't give it a super high score. I'm going to give this an 8.5 out of 10. It's no more expensive than some of its direct competition, but it is more expensive than others of its direct competition. So what does that give us? A total of 52.5 out of 60. And how does that stack up? Well, here are the scores. I go back and adjust the scores over time because life changes, and if I'm going to be directly comparing these scores, I can't compare scores to past scores. That's one of the issues with DP Review. They don't revise their old scores, and so it becomes a little bit dicey comparing them. So I'm trying to keep them current as much as I can to have these scores make sense. Overall, this is essentially exactly the camera that a lot of event and wedding photographers are looking for in 2021, 2022. It's not the best deal on the market, but it is a phenomenal upgrade and a solid, very well-rounded hybrid camera. If you want to pick one of these up, we have links in the description below to help support this channel and feed my fat cats. If you have any thoughts about this a7 IV, let me know down in the comments below and we'll talk about that. If you have any suggestions for future videos, we'll get on top of that as well. So, until next time, let's go take some photos.